All right, ready to dive deep. Today, we're exploring this idea of an inner family. You know, the internal family systems, IFS. We've got Dr. Richard Schwartz's book, Introduction to Internal Family Systems, and this YouTube interview with him. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff. Really makes you rethink how you see yourself.
It does. Like, instead of one whole self, we're a whole bunch of parts all interacting inside.
Right, like a whole system. And IFS is all about getting those parts to, cooperate, not just fight each other all the time.
But first, I gotta ask, did you think it was kind of strange, this whole talking to your parts thing?
I can see how it sounds weird at first, definitely.
Because honestly, it did for me too.
Yeah, it's not like literally little people in your head though, right? It's more like different sides of yourself, each with its own voice.
So like giving those voices some space to be heard.
Exactly. Even Dr. Schwartz said, people think it's a bit out there, but then whoa, it's actually super helpful.
Okay, so let's meet the family, shall we? First up, the exiles. Those parts of us that are kind of hurt, vulnerable, carrying old pain.
Like, think of a scared child who just wants to hide, right? Maybe they're holding on to past hurts or needs that weren't met.
Okay, so we got these sensitive exiles, but then we have the managers, total control freaks, trying to keep everything in check.
Yeah, like their mission is to prevent any meltdowns, keep things smooth, but they can be a little restrictive sometimes.
For sure. It's like when you're planning a trip and that voice pops up, what if everything goes wrong? Classic manager move.
Totally. Trying to avoid any discomfort. And sometimes, even with the manager's best efforts, the exiles get triggered.
Oh, and that's when the firefighters come in, right?
You got it. They're all about putting out the fire, but not always in the healthiest way. Think impulsive shopping sprees, zoning out on social media.
It's like they just want relief now.
Right. Not thinking long term, just got to soothe the pain in the moment.
Makes you wonder, those late night purchases, maybe they were about more than just the stuff.
Exactly. And that's where IFS gets interesting. Instead of judging these parts, we listen, try to understand them.
So curiosity is key.
Huge. Not about judging, but asking, why is this part so scared? What happened to make it this way?
That's a great point, because then you can start to be compassionate, right?
Totally. Understanding leads to compassion, and then you can start working with your parts, not against them.
The book actually has this story about Magda. She had this part that would, completely shut her down in social situations.
Oh, yeah. She was totally paralyzed, couldn't speak up, go after what she wanted.
And through IFS, she realized this part was terrified of rejection, humiliation.
Trying to protect her in its own clumsy way.
So not trying to sabotage her, just trying to help, but in a way that wasn't really working.
Exactly. But once she understood that, things started to shift.
Okay, so we got all these parts vying for attention, but there's another key player here, the self.
The self is like the core you. Calm, compassionate, clear, all those good things.
So how do you even know if yourself is in charge, or if it's one of the parts running the show?
It's a good question. It's often about how you're feeling. Are you calm and centered, or reactive and emotional?
So if I'm freaking out about a presentation, that's probably not myself at the wheel.
Probably not. And that's where the 8 C's of self-leadership come into here, like the signs of a self-led state. Okay,
let's hear about those C's. Calmness is the first one, right?
Yeah. Calmness is key for thinking clearly, making good decisions. When the self is leading, you can observe your parts without getting totally swept away.
So if I'm all anxious, that's my anxious part, not myself.
Right. And that's where the other C's come in, like clarity. With the self, you see things more objectively, not through fear or anger.
And clarity can lead to curiosity, which we were just talking about. So important for understanding our parts.
Yes. Curiosity helps you approach your parts with openness, not judgment.
And then there's compassion, which honestly is usually the opposite of how I treat myself when I'm struggling.
I hear you. Compassion is about recognizing that all your parts, even the tough ones, are trying to help you in their own way.
It's like giving yourself the same kindness you'd give a friend who's having a hard time.
Exactly. And that compassion can be super healing, creates safety and trust within your whole system.
It's a real game changer. Like, instead of beating myself up for feeling anxious, I can say, hey, anxiety, I see you, what's up?
Yeah, like that. And you'd be surprised how much that can shift things.
Okay, so we've got calmness, clarity, curiosity, and compassion. What are the other 4 C's of self-leadership?
So next up is confidence. When the self is leading, you trust yourself, you know you're worthy, You don't need others to tell you that.
So it's not about being arrogant. It's about this deep self-assurance that comes from knowing and accepting yourself, all your parts included.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And that confidence gives you courage to face your challenges, even when things get tough.
Courage is the 6th C, right?
It is. Courage helps you step outside your comfort zone, take risks, even when it feels scary.
Like if you're terrified of public speaking but really want to give that talk, courage is what gets you on stage.
Exactly. And then we have creativity, which is about tapping into your ideas, your inspiration.
Yeah.
When the self is there, you could be playful, try new things.
It's like you're not stuck in the same old routines. You can see things in a new way.
Exactly. And lastly, connectedness. It's about feeling like you belong, connected to yourself, others, the world around you.
Not just inner harmony, but a sense of being part of something bigger.
Right on. And that connection can be super grounding, especially during tough times.
Wow, those 8 C's are really powerful. It's so helpful to have those qualities in mind as we navigate our inner world and, life in general. But I'm curious, how does this whole IFS thing play out in real life, like beyond just individual therapy?
Well, Dr. Schwartz talks about how IFS can apply to everything. Relationships, work, even society as a whole.
Whoa, so it's not just about fixing what's wrong with us individually.
Nope, it's about creating healthier systems everywhere. He even compares parts of society to our inner parts.
So just as our inner critic can mess with our self-esteem, a societal part driven by fear or greed can cause chaos in the world.
Exactly. And those same IFS principles, curiosity, compassion, understanding, can help heal those divisions.
Wow, so personal healing can actually contribute to healing the world. That's a pretty amazing thought.
It is. And speaking of healing, Dr. Schwartz also talks about the link between IFS and physical health.
Oh, yeah. Didn't he mention some research on rheumatoid arthritis where focusing on the emotional needs of the parts actually reduced pain?
He did. It's wild, right? Makes you think maybe that random headache is actually your body trying to tell you something deeper is going on.
It really does. So by taking care of our inner world, we might actually be healing our physical bodies too.
It's definitely a possibility. It all points to this interconnectedness between mind and body.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So what we've learned so far is this. We all have these parts inside. We've got the self that can lead them. And by understanding these parts, we can create more harmony within ourselves and maybe even in the world around us.
You got it. It's about changing how we relate to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that could have ripple effects everywhere.
All right, so much to unpack here. In the next part, we'll delve deeper into the actual process of unburdening those exiles and explore some practical techniques for boosting that self-leadership, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into IFS. We've been, hanging out with our inner family, getting to know all the different parts.
All those exiles, managers, firefighters, trying to make sense of it all, right?
Exactly. And we've seen how understanding those parts can be super helpful, but what about actually healing them?
Yeah, that's the next step, right?
The book talks about this process called unburdening, and honestly, it sounds kind of intense.
Well, it can be pretty powerful, that's for sure.
So how does that work?
Okay, so remember how the self has all those qualities like calmness, compassion, curiosity?
Yeah, the good stuff.
Right. So in IFS therapy, you basically learn to tap into that self-energy and bring it to those wounded parts.
So like offering comfort to those hurt, scared parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's not about fixing them or telling them to get over it.
Just being there with them.
Yeah, creating a safe space for them to be seen, heard, understood.
It's almost like when you finally feel safe enough to open up to a friend about something you've been holding on to for ages.
That's a great analogy. There's so much relief in finally being able to share your story without judgment, and that's what unburdening is all about.
And as those exiles share their experiences, they can start to let go of the pain, the limiting beliefs.
Exactly. It's like a weight lifted off their shoulders. They can finally breathe again.
Wow. So those parts can actually transform.
They can, but it's not always a smooth ride, though.
What do you mean?
Well, those protective parts, the managers and firefighters, they might resist this whole unburdening thing.
Makes sense. They've been working so hard to keep those exiles contained.
Right. They might be afraid of what will happen if those emotions come pouring out.
So how do you work with that resistance?
A good IFS therapist will help you reassure those protective parts, let them know it's okay to step back, trust the process.
So it's not about forcing anyone to do anything they're not ready for.
Nope, it's about creating safety and trust within the whole system so healing can happen naturally.
Do you have an example of what that might look like?
Sure. Remember Magda from the book, the woman whose part was paralyzing her socially?
Oh, yeah, she was terrified of speaking up.
Right, so through IFS, she connected with that part, Really listen to its fears, all that fear of rejection and humiliation it had been carrying for years.
And just by listening, by offering compassion, things started to change for her.
Exactly. That part finally felt seen and understood, so it could start to let go of its old story.
It's amazing how powerful compassion can be.
It really is. But even after a part unburdens, there can still be, bumps in the road.
Really? Why is that?
Well, sometimes after a big emotional release, people need time to process,
Like they need to take a step back.
Yeah, and sometimes those protective parts might feel a bit shaken up by all the changes happening.
So patience is key.
Definitely. It's not going to be perfect all the time. And having a therapist who gets that can make a huge difference.
What about when those protective parts just won't budge? Like they're absolutely convinced it's not safe to let go.
That's where the self's patience and persistence come in. You got to keep approaching those parts with curiosity and compassion. Try to understand their fears.
So not arguing with them, but trying to build a relationship.
Exactly. It's like saying, hey, I see you're scared. I see how hard you're working to keep me safe. But what if there's another way? Can we work together on this?
So you're inviting them to be part of the solution.
Right. And as you build trust, your whole internal system becomes more harmonious.
It's incredible to think that those parts that seem so difficult, they can actually become allies in our healing journey.
Absolutely. And as we heal those inner divisions, we create more space for joy, creativity, connection, all those good things.
Speaking of connection, you mentioned how Dr. Schwartz talks about applying IFS to relationships, even society as a whole.
Yeah, he says so much of the conflict we experience with others comes from the same dynamics that play out in our inner families.
So, if we're constantly battling our inner critic, we might end up criticizing others too.
Totally. And on a bigger scale, if we're polarized within, we're more likely to see the world in black and white, us versus them.
Makes you think about all the division in the world right now. Maybe it's a reflection of the division within us.
It's a possibility, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Schwartz actually suggests that if we want to heal the world, we need to start by healing ourselves.
It's like that Gandhi quote, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. IFS can help us become those change agents, starting with our own inner families.
In the next part, we'll get into some of the practical tools from the book that can help us cultivate self-leadership and bring more of those 8 C's into our lives, so stick with us. Back for more IFS. We've been exploring this whole inner family idea and, learning to lead with the self.
Yeah, we've talked about understanding and healing those parts of us that are kind of hurting, and even how IFS can apply to relationships, even bigger systems.
But in this last part, I want to get practical. How do we actually put IFS into practice? It's one thing to talk about it, but how do we actually start working with those parts?
Right.
Yeah.
So the book has a bunch of tools and techniques.
Yeah.
One that really stands out is the path exercise.
Okay, what's that?
It's a visualization, basically. Helps you kind of separate from your parts and tap into that self-energy.
It's like creating space between you and those voices in your head.
Exactly. You imagine yourself on a path, leaving those parts behind, and you get to experience what it feels like to be free from their influence.
I've actually tried that. It's amazing how quickly you can shift into a calmer state.
Right. It's really powerful. You can actually feel the difference between being blended with your parts and accessing the self.
And the more you practice, the easier it gets, right?
Definitely. And the book also talks about meditation.
Oh, yeah. Good old meditation.
Dr. Schwartz, in the interview, he says even just a few minutes a day can make a huge difference in becoming aware of that self-energy.
It makes sense, quieting the mind, all that.
He describes it as a somatic, embodied feeling.
So not just an intellectual thing, but you actually feel it in your body.
Yeah, exactly. A sense of peace, groundedness.
It makes you wonder, maybe that's why meditation is so important in so many spiritual traditions.
It's possible.
Okay, so we've got the path exercise, meditation, but what about actually interacting with those parts? What does that look like?
Remember the 8 C's?
The 8 C's of self-leadership.
Yeah, those are super important for those inner conversations.
So let's say I'm being really hard on myself, my inner critic is in overdrive, what do I do?
Instead of getting caught up in the criticism, try getting curious about that part. What's its intention? Is it trying to protect you? What's it afraid of?
It's almost like talking to a scared kid, right? You wouldn't yell at them, you'd try to understand their fear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of IFS. You can approach all parts of yourself with compassion.
Yeah.
Even the ones that seem, difficult.
That's a good reminder because sometimes those parts can feel really scary.
They can, but remember, they're all part of you. They all have a reason for being there.
In the interview, Dr. Schwartz talked about polarization, within ourselves and in society.
Oh yeah, like we're always battling it out, internally and externally.
It seems like we're always stuck in this us versus them mentality.
He compared it to delegates from different countries, each one convinced they have the only right answer.
So how do we get out of that trap?
IFS says, instead of trying to silence those voices or pick a winner, we become the mediator.
So the self steps in and creates a space for dialogue.
Exactly. It's about shifting from us versus them to we're all in this together.
It's like those delegates finally realizing they have a common goal.
Right. And that's where the 8 C's come in. The calmness to stay grounded, the clarity to see through the polarized views, the compassion to hold space for everyone's pain.
Makes sense. It's not about ignoring the conflict, but leading with wisdom and balance.
And as those parts experience that self-leadership, they start to trust that their needs will be met.
It's amazing. It's like that inner critic finally chills out a bit, realizes there's a better way.
Totally. And those inner shifts can have ripple effects in our outer world too.
It goes back to what Dr. Schwartz said about healing ourselves to heal the world.
It all starts within, right?
We also haven't really talked about the spiritual side of IFS.
Right. Dr. Schwartz does hint at that.
In the interview, he talks about the self as a spiritual connection point, even uses the phrase transpersonal.
Yeah, he seems to believe it's more than just our individual psychology.
It's almost like there's this deeper wisdom, this source of healing that goes beyond our personal experiences.
It's a pretty profound idea.
As we wrap up this deep dive into IFS, what's one thing you want to leave our listeners with?
Imagine this. What if those parts of you that you struggle with the most, the ones that criticize or scare you, what if they're actually holding the keys to your greatest freedom?
That's interesting.
What if by approaching them with curiosity and compassion, you could discover hidden strengths, profound wisdom, and a wellspring of healing? And not just for yourself, but for the world around you.
That's a powerful thought. Thank you for taking us on this journey. It's really given me a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, the journey of self-discovery never really ends, so keep exploring, keep listening, and keep trusting the wisdom of your own inner family.